Welcome, everyone. My name's Lori Cook. I'm a board member with the IACD. Sarah Banks is also on here to help facilitate as well. And I presented with the Researchers Forum a few months ago, and that's how I got to know about the IACD. So if there's anyone new here, welcome as well. I'd also invite you to put your names and where you're currently joining us from in the chat. And also, as Sarah had mentioned earlier, any useful links or anything you might want to share with everyone, that would be great. Today we have two presenters. I'm going to introduce the first one, and then there'll be a presentation for 15 minutes or so. And I'll give a time warning as we get close to the end of that time. And then there'll be a second presentation, and then we'll have time for questions and answers and some discussion at the end. So as you have questions, if you when we get to that section of things, you can put those in the chat, or if you indicate to put a hand up that you have a question, then Jessica, our administrative coordinator, can unmute, right, Jessica? And people can actually say their question if they want. So yeah, we'll get started with the first presenter. So this is Naumai Taurua from New Zealand, and she is a PhD candidate in Indigenous community-led business development. And she currently lives in Australia, but she's in New Zealand today, I think. And she splits her career between teaching adults and various business roles, mostly within the Maori community. And her presentation is going to be on the Indigenous community-led business model. Building community wealth is the objective of the Indigenous-led community business model. It builds business in a remote Indigenous community experiencing high unemployment. The model meets the criteria for government grants funding, as the community leads its own business development with the expertise of a tribal facilitator and project manager. Apparently, while the government has empathy for the Indigenous community, it is also the sensible option to reduce social welfare dependency and create long-term and address long-term unemployment. So that is what Naumai will be speaking to now. And then after Naumai, Ryan Gibson will be speaking about community wealth building, and I'll introduce Ryan more when it's time for the second presentation. Okay, Naumai, take it away.
My name is Naumai Taurua, as I have just been introduced. So Māori is an oratory race. Start with the prayer, a karakia, or start with the proverb, a whakatauki. So without any further ado, mā te rongo ka mohio, mā te mohio ka marama, mā te marama ka mātou, mā te mātou ka ora, tihei mauri ora. Pipiha. This is about me. I come from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and my tribe comes from the top of New Zealand, Tai Tukarau. I am Ngāpuhi, that is my tribe. And we came to New Zealand approximately 900 years ago on the canoe Mātātua. My sub-tribe identifies with the mountain Pourua, and I belong to the sub-tribe of Ngātakawa, and that is our marae, our meeting house, Ora Mahue. I also belong to the sub-tribe of Ngāti Rahiri, and that is our meeting house, our marae, Waitangi. Kingi and Polly Taurua are my parents. I belong to the family Taurua. My name is Naumai Taurua. Greetings once, greetings twice, greetings 3 times. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this presentation today on Te Pau Hapu Pākehī, the Indigenous Community Business. So in a nutshell, this is a repeatable and systemic business model. I'll just put that over there. And so we can take that business model to the top of New Zealand. The Indigenous community builds their business, they tweak it to suit themselves, and then they have a community business. That same business model is taken to Australia. The Indigenous community build their own business, they tweak it to suit themselves, and then they have a business. Then that business model is brought back here to New Zealand. It's taken to the bottom of the South Island. The Indigenous community builds their own business. They tweak it to suit themselves, and then they have a community business. So the foundation of the business model is the community works together collectively as one voice. They make their own decisions as they develop their own business, and they work collaboratively with the wider community, organisations and government to achieve their business goals. At the end of 4 years, they will own and govern their own business. Now, it works for them collectively because they operate from the foundation of their own cultural knowing, their own culture, the way they do things around there. And everything else, like new concepts, capability building, is layered on top of their cultural knowing, and they are able to lead and flow with their own business build. So the journey started for me in 2006 when Sir Paul Reeves gave a presentation at a symposium, and he said that by 2050, in New Zealand, for every one person not working, defined by the government as under 15 years of age and over 65, which is our retirement age, there would only be 1.2 people working. And that was coming about because the baby boomer generation was retiring. So I marinated on it for a few years and realized that without intervention, poverty and deprivation would be the norm amongst the Māori people. In general, the statistics say that unemployment is higher for Māori than non-Māori, and those living in isolated areas and country Māori are more likely to experience unemployment than city Māori. Now, here in the north, where I come from, unemployment is very, very high, and there is very little permanent work. There is only seasonal and labour-intensive work like picking kiwi fruit and grading, or pine trees. So you have these 60-year-olds, 65-year-olds who are on their feet all day, or running up and down big hills as they plant pine trees. And it's hard work, and they do it for minimum wage. As well, we now have up here third generation unemployment. So you have the younger generation now having their own children, and they have never known their grandparents, my age, to be in full-time work. So the grandparents are on a benefit, the parents are on a benefit, they are on a benefit. What hope do their children have? So in 2012, I decided to conduct research, and the question was, what factors will develop a sustainable community business and still meet the criteria for government funding? By sustainable, the community, as part of the business model, would identify their natural resources. And once the business experts exited, the community would still be able to do for themselves. It was a mixed method research. Sorry, I'll just move that. over there. It was mixed method research, and I interviewed community development advisors. Now, they were really good because they were able to provide information on the factors that would yield a successful community development project. As well, they directed me to the community-led development principles of working together collectively and collaboratively. And those principles were the government's new framework for awarding grants and funding for community development. Now, economic development is community development was not widely practiced in New Zealand at that time. And as a systemic practice, it still really isn't. So I looked overseas and I found a system called inclusive business, and organizations that use this system go into developing countries, e.g. war-torn countries or third world countries, and support the community, the family, the individual to start their own business. Really simple ideas like raising chickens to sell their eggs, opening a bicycle repair shop, recycling used plastic, melting it down and turning it into jewelry to sell to the tourists. But in countries with no social welfare benefit, it gave the family money to put food on the table and to pay the bills. These organizations gain their capital from philanthropic investors, and because of this, they had to qualify what the money was spent on. So there was lots of information that I could draw upon. So using grounded theory, the data was reduced and the community-led business model was created. Now, the elements that I found from the national research, from the interviews and focus research, they are the successful elements that would make a community development project. And overseas, from the inclusive business system, they are existing business practices to build a successful community business. So in 2020, I decided to conduct further research to see if the community-led business model would develop an Indigenous community business. 2 meetings occurred and then COVID shut us down. However, I analysed the information that I received, and I realised that the tribe, for the first meeting, they didn't understand the Western style of meeting, and because of this, they were not able to contribute to discussion on the topic of building a community business, and they were not able to flow. So coming from that tribe, I automatically swapped into my cultural way of doing things. So that picture there is Taurua Mountain, and we went up to the mountain and spent the whole day up there and took food, which is a very Māori thing. While we were up there, we discussed business ideas, and the tribe decided that it would be 2 stages. Now, for Māori, the mountain is alive and the ancestors are alive. It's just the ancestors are separated by a curtain. So then follows the old people, the babies, the children, with the youth and adults interchanging at the end. So the first stage, it was decided it would be conservation of the mountain, and as well there would be seats built at different levels up the mountain and shelter, so that the elders and the parents could be sheltered from the elements. The business idea was it was going to be a walking trail and 360 views at the top, and then once the tourists reached the top, there would be stories would be told. So that would be the first stage, and the second stage, while the tribe would come back together again and discuss further business build. So from that piece of research, the Indigenous community-led business model was created. The business model stays the same, but now around the outside is community culture, tikanga, and that ensures that the community leads from their own cultural knowing, and they make decisions with everything else layered on top. This model meets the criteria for grants and funding from the New Zealand and Australian governments, as well. It meets the criteria for government business expertise. The Indigenous community business is built. Once that's finished, the family business, e.g. by the van to bring the tourists in, or the sole trader, the arts and crafts person, can link into the main business. So there are two business professionals attached to this business model. One is the facilitator, and they take care of the community culture. They make sure that the community always leads from their own cultural knowing, the community spirit, and the community well-being. They have to be a member of the tribe or sub-tribe. So for that reason, facilitator training will need to take place. And it will be a Māori leadership approach, community-led development principles, which meets the funding for government, and general facilitation skills. The other role is the Agile project manager, and they take care of the technical business build. So they will follow a project management process. They take care of the funding and the capital, and they also will establish the business networks with the wider community, which will then enable the Indigenous community to link into the wider community to achieve their business goals. So the benefits for the community is that it generates employment. And in the Western world, elders, the young people just starting out, the physically and mentally challenged, have a real hard time trying to enter into the workplace. Whereas in a community, they know their own. They know they can be adaptable, so they are able to provide work for all. As well, it advances the social structure. The drugs and alcohol is much reduced because they are learning work ethics, they are learning work patterns. As well, anger and fighting is reduced because money is coming into the household to put food on the table to pay the bills. The community will contribute to the local economy. It will also contribute to the national GDP. More importantly, as the community makes their decisions and as they lead in their business build, they become chiefs of their own business. They become chiefs of their own community. And the children not yet born are born with belonging. They are born with identity. So my future research is that I will develop a facilitator training package and then trial that package in a real life community business. And the focus is to empower.
Just wanted to let you know a couple of more minutes, okay?
Thank you. The focus is to enable the community to lead its own business build, to make its own decisions. So in Māoridom, there is a saying, hea te mea nui o tēnei ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. So what's the most important thing in this world? It's the people, the people, the people. And for this business model, when the parents are fine, the family is fine. When the family is fine, the extended family is fine. When the extended family is fine, the tribe is fine. When the tribe is fine, the land, the air, the sea is fine. Nā reira. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Naumai. Okay, so we're going to move on to our second presenter, Ryan Gibson. And I'll just tell you a little bit about Ryan, who I happen to know fairly well because we were both on the board for the Canadian Community Economic Development Network, CEDNET, for a few years. Ryan is an associate professor in rural planning and development at the University of Guelph. He's also past president of the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation and the Canadian Community Economic Development Network, CEDNET. Ryan has a deep intrigue and respect for rural communities, rural people, and the events that shape their futures. His presentation will be on embedding wealth in communities, experiences from rural Canada. And a brief description of his presentation is that it will speak to how rural and small communities can benefit from existing wealth to build their futures. Insights from community wealth building experiences from rural Canada will be shared, focusing on lessons learned, impacts, and transferability. All right. So Ryan, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Laura, for that introduction. And before I get going, I should make sure everyone can hear me okay. Perfect. I see a few heads nodding, so I'm not speaking into the abyss. Thanks for the introduction, Laura. Naumai, wonderful presentation, and I think we'll hear some parallels with some of the work that is taking place in rural Canada. And good morning to everyone, good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. It's wonderful to share this snapshot of research that's currently taking place on wealth building from the Canadian perspective throughout rural Canada. Let's see here. So over the next 10 or 15 minutes, what I'm hoping to share with you are these four components, kind of give you a sense of my own positionality, my lens that I'm bringing to this, looking at the issues of wealth building in the Canadian rural context, and then want to share some specific research that's been taking place with a series of programs that we're calling community investment programs. And then finally, just leave you with kind of a few thoughts around moving forward that might also speak to some transferability of what will take place. Feel free to drop in questions to the chat box. You'll see my email on most of the screen, or most of the slides on the screen. And at the end of the presentation, I'll also share a link with everybody where the slide deck, you can find it yourself, as well as some online resources and materials that you might find of interest. In terms of myself, I grew up in southern Manitoba in a settler family on the traditional territory, the Anishinaabe and the Cree in southern Manitoba. This is a picture of my hometown. Today, the population is about 14 to 15 people, depending on which day you count. And back in 1882, my hometown was once described by the official government registry as consisting of one log house and a stable, which in the distance might easily be mistaken for a snowbank. Back in 1882. And I grew up in these small communities, witnessing the outmigration of young people, witnessing the economic transformations, and I was absolutely fascinated by rural change. I am a rural geographer by training, and I work at the University of Guelph in southern Ontario in central Canada, which sits on the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, and is part of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant. I will just speak briefly, as I think this audience might be curious, but my position at the University of Guelph is a bit unique. I hold a research chair position called the Liberal Professorship in Regional Economic Development. But the reason it's unique and might be of interest is it was actually created by community to ensure that there's a professor at the university that is directly related in rural economic development. And I'm happy to say it's kind of a small e economic, really around community development. So through the credit union and two families, they provided a gift to the university that's allowed us to do a whole raft of different research, engaging with community and taking direction from community on that front. So there's multiple ways to think about wealth building, how to build it, how to collect it, how to use it. And this presentation emerges from some research that has been investigating how we can embed wealth that already exists in rural communities to facilitate long-term community-led and place-based development. In this initiative, we specifically are looking at a series of community investment programs that incentivize community wealth building, and particularly I'm interested in the impacts that these programs have or don't have for small communities, rural communities, northern communities, and Indigenous communities. When I'm speaking about rural Canada, I'm referring to the approximately 6 million people that live in a community with less than 10,000 people. This is about 17% of Canada's population, and it represents communities that have low population densities, often high distances to urban centers. They tend to have kind of lower economic diversification, strong ties to natural resource-based economies, and historically low population growth rates, and today often areas of population decline or of stagnant population growth. And I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but I grew up right on the Canada-US border, south in the southern part of Manitoba, which you may or may not be able to see my cursor. So let's turn to the community investment programs in Canada. By way of background, and I suspect this is not much different than many of the communities that you're working with, but many businesses lack access to financial capital, either to start their business enterprise, whether it is to grow their business, or whether it is to diversify their business. And this business could be a small entrepreneurship initiative. It could be medium or large scale. We also know that in the Canadian context, there's an incredible amount of wealth that is invested, particularly through banks, in terms of investment funds, in terms of retirement savings and pensions. But we also know at the same time there's this dichotomy that people are increasingly wanting to invest locally, but most of the financial institutions in the country of Canada don't provide very adequate options for local investment. They tend to put it into the international community for those investments. And from this, kind of these perspectives, this is where the community investments programs were created as an opportunity to connect citizen investors to local businesses and to local or regional economic development opportunities. When we look across Canada, these programs are designed and are facilitated by subnational governments. So not the government of Canada, but rather the provincial and territorial governments. And they started back in 1999. The community investment programs have a variety of different names. Sometimes they're called community investment funds. Sometimes they're called community economic development investment funds. But for the sake of this presentation and to prevent confusion with lots of acronyms, I'm just going to refer to them as community investment programs. These programs are provincially regulated to increase investment in local economic development opportunities. They also have to adhere to a series of regulations related to what we in Canada refer to the Securities Commission to ensure that investments are being done properly and that they are protected. To encourage people to participate in these community investment programs, there is a tax incentive that is provided by the provincial governments that you'll see in a moment, ranges in size. And as we speak, there are 6 provinces that currently operate a community investment program in the territories, the provinces of Nova Scotia, where Laurie Cook is based, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Quebec, Manitoba, and British Columbia. But less than half of the provincial and territorial governments actually participate in these programs. So our research has been interested to find out, how do these investment programs operate? Are they working in rural communities? And what might we be able to do to enhance these programs to really ensure that we have locally driven, community-based, and place-based development? We conducted a review of all of the policy documents that are out there, the statistics available, as well as any of the community-based literature on these programs and their actual applications, as well as conducted a series of interviews with government policy analysts and program staffs from each of the community investment programs to better understand the program, the application process, the implementation, as well as its evaluation. So across Canada, this table presents the 6 community investment programs down that first column on your far right, left-hand side. And then you'll see that these programs have been created since 1999, first in Nova Scotia, as recent as the province of Alberta in 2018. And then across this table, you can see some of the various characteristics of these investments programs. There's a tax incentive if you provide your funding anywhere from 35% up to 50%, as well as a requirement that your funding needs to be invested for a minimum length of time, whether that's 3 to 5 years. You'll also note in this table kind of the maximum amount of money that can be invested, anywhere between 50,000 and upwards to 250,000 for individuals, but also the ability for corporations to invest. As you move forward on the table to the right-hand side, you'll see that the rural focus, that most of these are not rural focused programs. They are kind of universal programs that are designed for both urban and rural communities. But by default, in many of these programs, the majority of the participants are actually rural, northern, and Indigenous communities. So you can see there's a lot of information in this table, but in a sense, 6 programs between 1999 and 2018, all of them provide a tax credit, provided you keep your investment in the community investment program for a minimum of 3 years or upwards to 5 years, depending on your jurisdiction. So this now brings us to the notion of, what did we learn through this research of speaking with these community investment programs? First and foremost, we found that rural communities are using the community investment programs. There's approximately $33 million Canadian invested in the programs across Canada and around 5,700 individual investors. What we heard through the interviews and through the documentation is that local champions are absolutely critical to the success of the application to create the investment programs, implement the programs, as well as to maintain the reporting requirements from each of the provinces. We also found that where there is a strong rural component, there tends to be a very strong linkages to the cooperative movement and cooperative business formats. Interestingly enough, the places and locations with the highest tax return do not equate to the highest program uptake by investors or by communities. The provinces and programs with that higher 50% tax incentive actually have the lowest participation in the program to date, which speaks to the motivation of investors is not that solely of financial gain, but speaks to that notion that they're also very much interested in that community development and the connection to the initiative and to the mandate and to the purposes of that business. We also heard loud and clear that there are significant steep learning curves to participate in the community investment programs, and that most organizations and individuals that are interested in pursuing it lose that interest and lose that momentum before they actually make a formal application. Requirements around how to structure the program, how to go through the securities commissions, how to issue shares, simply deters rural communities from participating. They essentially find other ways to get things done that doesn't require the administrative and the bureaucratic burdens that are placed on them by this program. So we know that there's a huge impact and potential. The impact at the moment is significant, but we also know there is a huge potential for rural communities to continue to utilize these programs for local economic development. To give you a sense of some of the programs that they're working on at the moment, this could be anything from wind energy, farms, solar energy. There are communities using the community investment programs around reducing barriers for young families and newcomers to enter agriculture industries. Another one is looking at doing seafood processing. So once local seafood has been caught in rural communities, doing the value-added processing and packaging in community as opposed to exporting that raw commodity into the urban centers where those jobs for processing would otherwise be located. So there are a huge potential for this program to be benefiting rural communities. And that maybe brings me towards the end of my presentation, which is really looking at how do we move forward. To have a bigger and a better impact for rural communities, these investment programs, we need to enhance the capacity to navigate these programs so that communities don't get deterred from joining it and are able to reap those benefits. We also heard loud and clear from practitioners, but also from government policymakers, which was also interesting, that the need for a community of practice among people who are in the program, as well as people that are wanting to join these programs. Within each of the provincial governments, there often is 1, 2, or maybe 3 staff people that often are feeling very isolated within their own government ministry, and they don't realize there are other people that are doing similar programs across the country. We heard loud and clear the need to reduce the barriers to apply to the program so that communities can succeed. And one of the other critical components that we discovered is that there's very little data on these programs captured, which makes evaluating them incredibly difficult. And so the ability to encourage governments and other agencies to better collect data so that we know not simply how much money is invested, but what is that money being invested in, by whom, in which communities, and what the impacts of those benefits are not well documented. And for many communities, the benefits that rural communities are looking for are not necessarily the same benefits that urban policymakers are striving towards as it relates to jobs created or wealth created. Often rural communities are looking at stemming out migration of young people, sustaining existing jobs to keep people there, and looking at it from more of a well-being and quality of life perspective as opposed to simply capital E economic indicators. And within Canada, there's also a really interesting opportunity at the moment to explore the linkages between these community investment programs and the fairly newly created social innovation, social finance funds that have been created by the federal government. And at the moment, these two initiatives operate kind of as they're parallel, but they're not connected in any strategic way at the moment. And there's a huge opportunity to better do that. While I've got everyone as a captive audience, I thought I would also share with you an upcoming event in case it is of interest that'll be taking place in County Galway in June of 2024. It's called the North Atlantic Forum. It's around sustainable livelihoods for rural, remote, Northern Island communities. And they're currently accepting calls for contributions from community partners and other organizations. You would have seen it in the latest IACD newsletter, but I thought I would flag it there for everyone just in case it was not front and center. And lastly, just to say, I'm going to wrap up before Laurie waves at me or hooks me off or mutes me. But in doing so, there is a paper that is available that you can find online through the Journal of Community Development. But more importantly, you'll find these particular slides, a link to this journal article, as well as some other online resources at that website that's listed at the bottom left-hand side of the slide. And I'll also stick that in the chat box so that people don't have to frantically try to type it all out on that front. But maybe I'll leave it at that and turn it back over to yourself, Laurie.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Wonderful presentations from both Ryan and Naumai, and some interesting potential connections. I'd like to invite anyone who has a question to either put it in the chat or to put your hand up. You can either just wave your hand, or if you can put your electronic hand up, then we'll have a sense of who has a question. And Jessica can also, you can also unmute yourself and ask your question verbally if you like as well. Just while people are thinking of questions, I just, because I'm familiar with the Community Economic Development Investment Funds, Nova Scotia was the first province to have one of these programs. I wanted to ask a question, Ryan, just to, while people are thinking about other questions. One of the things I've heard over the years is that there used to be a staff person within the Nova Scotia government that could help community groups to develop these investment funds, because there's a significant learning curve and significant regulations around developing one of these funds. So I wonder if you could just comment on, and that person was let go several years ago. And it's caused a real problem in Nova Scotia. It's really up to volunteers to have to figure out how to create one of these investment funds and deal with the Department of Finance in order to try and create one of these funds. So I just wonder if you could comment on the importance or relevant, how important having staff people within the government to help guide community groups who want to create such funds while we're waiting for people to think of other questions.
Yeah, it's a great question, Lori, and I think it's a critical question in the sense that we heard from all jurisdictions that having point people inside government was really critical, that understood the program and could help people navigate. Because right now there is this disconnect happening in many of the provinces where they have discontinued that service of having somebody, body or two within government that can help facilitate, and not only just facilitate questions, but actually go out to communities and meet with community leaders where they're at, help guide them and understand what they're doing. That has disappeared in almost all jurisdictions. It's not surprising that that disappearance also correlates to the number of applications that are coming in. So as those positions have decreased, the number of applicants coming in has decreased, which unfortunately some policy analysts and some in government have interpreted as there's not a need for these programs. As the participation rate has declined, government has said maybe we don't need to continue this, which is unfortunate because there is such a critical need for the program. But unfortunately, there's that disconnect. So expecting communities to navigate these incredibly complicated systems by themselves is unrealistic. I am excited to share that in places like New Brunswick, they actually move the positions outside of government and move them into the community development social sector, where organizations are able to provide that service to both members and the general public to help facilitate that. But without that, it would be incredibly difficult.
Thanks for that. And I'll just note in Nova Scotia, that is a reality we're looking at, is that as the number of applications have gone down, there are rumors that the program may be cut, which would be ironic considering Nova Scotia was one of the first provinces to create this kind of program. I see a hand up from Sarah. So Sarah, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you both very, very much. I think those are really interesting and challenging presentations, actually, that we can work at thinking in terms of our own cultural and community settings. And I suppose your last point, Ryan, where your answer to Laurie in the end was that community development workers on site in the communities is probably the answer. You need a kind of broker. Links with Naumai's concept of the cultural facilitator. I thought that was a really interesting and important idea, Naumai, and wondered a bit more about how that had emerged. It's a kind of obvious thing when you think about it, but how you're going to do the training for facilitators and what you see might be some of the challenges for them as they get going in this role.
So the facilitator coming from the tribe, they know how the tribe works, and they can learn to be a facilitator. I'm an adult educator anyway, training, tutoring or lecturing, whichever hat I tend to put on. So the challenges that I see, to tell you the truth, we have not pursued the business build of our people since we started, because there is a lot of fighting going on. They are very anger is our default when we're born, and we are a warrior, a fighting race anyway. So the facilitator who is learning how to facilitate will be able to navigate through all those issues, all those concerns, and keep the tribe on, keep them focused and keep them moving forward. So for us, the challenge is getting over the anger and stopping them from attacking each other personally.
Well, good luck with that. I think that's a really interesting program of work. So we'll be interested to hear more about it when you've got it developed. Thank you.
Anyone else have any questions? Okay, well, people are thinking maybe a little bit more about what else they might want to ask. I was just going to note with Ryan, and some people may be familiar with this movement or not, but in Nova Scotia in the 30s to the 50s, there was a movement, a folk school movement around cooperatives called the Antigonish movement. And the highlight of the Antigonish movement was creating study circles among very poor, resource-based people in rural communities. So fisher people, forestry people, people who were working with the land, but were not being paid much. And the real focus, which the folk school movement, coming from Denmark, as I understand it, and Scandinavian countries, was really a hallmark of really advancing rural economic development in Nova Scotia. I'm wondering if some of the ideas of the folk school movement, Ryan, could be applied to some of the challenges related to, and the steep learning curve related to the CDIF program.
Yeah, I think there's a really natural linkage, as you just mentioned, Laurie, between the two. I think there's a really, whether it's the folk school movement, whether it's the cooperative movement, I think there are within communities these existing cultures, these existing practices that have been used in the past very successfully. We don't need to go back to the drawing board to recreate the wheel. There are opportunities to build on those activities if there's a willingness by central agencies, and because this particular community investment program is an initiative of central governments, the subnational governments, it needs their buy-in and participation in the program to better empower communities to do that at the end of the day. And I'm not sure that's necessarily there at the moment for most of the provincial governments. And I should mention, of the 6 programs, Nova Scotia is the oldest, but there is, as you mentioned, Laurie, rumors that it may be discontinued or dismantled. We do know that the Alberta program that was created in 2018 has been discontinued. A change in political government. The new government came in and discontinued that particular initiative. So there is a political will that is necessary to make these programs operate.
And I see two people with hands up with questions, so I'll get to those in just a moment, but I'll just finish off that question with a comment or an observation that the St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia and their extension department was a principal player in advocating for and creating the folk school movement in Nova Scotia in the 30s and 50s that did help with study circles based in rural communities. So I do think there is a strong role for universities and educational organizations to partner with community to help make these things happen. So I see 2 questions. I think it was, I don't know if it's Thies or Tees.
Yes. Yes.
But Tees,
Oh,
if
yes.
you want to go first, and then Jim, I see your hand up as well.
Yes, thank you. I don't know if you did mention it in your presentation, Ryan, but I would be interested to hear what was the impact of the program that the CIBs programs. How many businesses was established? What's the success rate of those businesses? Have you got anything about the impact matrix from those programs?
Yeah, great question. I had a slide on it, but in lieu of time, I thought I better get through it all on that front. So happy to share a few of the statistics. First and foremost, the statistics are poorly captured, is what we found. There's no reporting requirements back to the provincial governments for most of their activities beyond simply the financial measures. So we know that approximately $3 million are generated in community investment programs each year within this 5 operating programs. And that typically represents between 1 and 4 new business opportunities. Each of those opportunities can raise capital up to a maximum of $3 million individually. In terms of their success rates at the moment, the success rate is north of 87% across all of the programs. So very, very strong rate. Partly that is a byproduct of a lot of organizations simply don't go through the entirety of the process to get to an application because of the difficulties in the learning curve. So those that make it to the finish line tend to be very well structured, and those that have not succeeded often actually become part of the next iteration of a future investment fund. And so they're actually, salvaged is not the right verb, but they are not necessarily a failure in the sense that there's a loss of income. In the event that they are unsuccessful, I should mention there is an investment guarantee by the government. So the individual investor has protections so that their investment fund is not lost at a personal level up to certain amounts, and that changes by province and jurisdiction. So yes, they're successful kind of anywhere between 1 and 3 per year per jurisdiction, usually somewhere around the $1 million mark per initiative, but it doesn't need to be that high. Most of the ones that have been started over the last 5 years tend to be very capital infrastructure intensive, like windmills and agricultural land acquisition. And the success rate is very, very high, much higher than normal business success rates.
Wow. Good.
Okay, Jim.
Yes, thanks very much for 2 very interesting presentations. And I don't know how many people are here from the UK, but it's just to say that political will, which Ryan mentions, is so key if you take the UK context, where we have very much a neoliberal political agenda. And in a sense, some of the kind of ideas there, and I'm not actually sure as to whether people around community development actually have absorbed the notion of community economic development. And we have one kind of major organization called CLARES, Community and Local Economic Strategies, which has been operational now in the UK. And I think what CLARES argues is really a challenge to that neoliberal agenda, and it's a challenge to the inequalities that exist in the UK. So, for example, CLARES really establishes some principles which are quite close to what you've described of plural ownership of the economy. One of the CLARES principles, making financial power work for local places, a principle. Progressive procurement of goods and services, a principle. Socially productive use of land and property, a principle. And for the Scots who are here, I think land and property, 90+% of the land in Scotland is owned by people who live outside Scotland. That's a reality of talking about community economic development when you have that kind of situation. But I think CLARES is trying to challenge that, and I may be behind things, but I don't have a sense that community development, education and training in England has got the economic component in it very strongly. But that's the impression I have anyway. Thank you.
That's interesting you mentioned that, Jim, because what I've noticed is in Canada, the economic lens is very, very strong in community development. We, as I've mentioned before, our main national community development organization is actually the Community Economic Development Network of Canada. I just wanted to make another, Ryan, do you want to respond to anything that Jim was saying?
No, I think I was taking notes, Jim, as you were typing. So I need to do a bit of homework around the UK situation and these clairs to better understand them. But I think you identify a really interesting contestation in this, in the fact that these programs are driven by neoliberalist ideologies around market efficiencies. But the rationale for community motivations is often, the central tenets of community development around solidarity, collectiveness, and these seem to be at odds with each other in terms of a policy direction and kind of program motivations. But at the same time, they're working, and people have been able to figure out how to navigate kind of the community development, the solidarity into these neoliberalist policies and programs. And there's even a politician here in Canada that has gone so far as to say that, the existence of these community investment programs is really an opportunity for government to abdicate the responsibility to small towns, that they will empower people to invest, but then walk away in terms of service delivery. Whether that's, it's a particular politician's perspective on it, it's quite kind of the extreme, but one can see the argument at times within that particular approach. And I think there's parallels in the UK situation, there's parallels in other corners of the globe as well. So it's an interesting contestation that I think would be remiss not to keep our finger on the pulse of this as we kind of move forward with this. The experience in New Zealand that Naumai was presenting and others is quite interesting.
Did you have anything else to add, Jim?
Yes, it's just to be fair, there are one or two examples north of the border. I live in northeast England, but I know that there are some initiatives north of the border in Scotland, because the Scottish government has different ideology, from the English government, and some of the kind of land use and some of the kind of land ownership, it's the beginning of a move, but whether it'll ever be substantial is the big question. But I think the point in terms of our forum like today, as to what part community development, education and training contains these economic kind of things that we've heard today. And my experience is that it tends not to be that, but I may be behind in that. But that's just the impression I have, that community development, education and training, it needs to go a bit faster on the economic development issues and themes, in my view. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll get to you in a second, Tis. But I just wanted to add another observation I've had here in Canada. I don't know about in other provinces, but in Nova Scotia, many of the CDIFs, Community Economic Development Investment Funds in Nova Scotia, are cooperative based in their structure. They're financial co-ops. So I think where there is a history of the cooperative movement and using cooperative structures, there's an easier jump to making use of these types of programs. I don't know if you would agree with that, Ryan, or correct me on that. Maybe yes. He's nodding yes. Okay. So Tis, if you want to ask your question.
Yes. A thought that came up with was that the financial support program that you're speaking about, what's the linkage between that and crowdfunding? Is there any one of those that actually got citizens involved through a crowdfunding campaign?
So from within Canada, crowdfunding would be a separate source of income. Crowdfunding is not a registered investment. And so as a result, the community investment programs are highly regulated. They're a formal security or investment deposit that has a legal responsibility to it. Whereas the crowdfunding is a voluntary, informal donation of money to a cause or to an initiative that is taking place. We haven't looked at whether any of the community investment programs have used a crowdfunding platform before. It's something I'll take a note of, but because of the different structures, we've only looked at these government regulated investment funds.
Okay, so continue to think about questions and either put them in the chat or raise your hand in some way, either electronically or waving, and I'll get to you. Naumai, I wanted to ask you a question actually, and then Ryan, if you have anything you want to add to it after Naumai answers. But I was just thinking, in both circumstances, community champions, I think, are very, very important. In Nova Scotia, for one of the most successful CDIF programs is called FarmWorks, which tends to be a program that's focused on supporting local food production and distribution of local food in different ways, whether restaurants or farmers markets or local markets. And I know it only got off the ground because there was at least one or two people and then a very strong board that was brought together that has been very strong over the years. A really good governance happening with that organization, and they've done multiple offers to the community. And Naumai, I just wanted you and Ryan, if you like, to, I'm curious the role of community champions or how you get started with the kind of community economic development you were talking about in Maori communities. Is it someone outside coming in, or is it usually someone within the community reaching out? How do you see, I don't know if you looked at this in your research or generally, but how does the community economic development process that you've been talking about usually start to happen within communities?
So this process is new and it's not practiced in New Zealand, state of the art, I guess. So at the moment, it's talking communities into doing something differently. In the past, what they have done is that they will have, say, a parcel of land, and they've decided that they will put on a farm, turn it into a farm, which is quite traditional way of thinking. But my business model is that you go into the community, and the community decides according to its assets what business that they will put into place, whereas traditionally farming, fishing, just the real basic, the usual businesses are put into place. So to answer your question, it's marketing as a new way of thinking.
And is there, I'm wondering if you can comment maybe a little bit more on the role of adult education within advancing the model that you were talking about, and also the you mentioned it's often someone coming into the community because it's a new model, and yet I know culture is a very important, coming from being rooted in the local culture is a very important piece of your model. Does it need to be more people who are from the communities to be trained as facilitators who can go into communities, or is it other people learning about the culture and then, even if they're outsiders, at least being aware of the culture and working from that cultural perspective?
In my research, I discovered that it's better for the community to have someone from their culture. or their tribe. So Māori are not too bad because we're quite, what's the word? We're closer. But if you go to places like Australia, the distances are huge. They're 1,000 miles from each other. They're 500 miles from each other. So you have to have someone from the community who can bring that community together. And that's why you need the two business professionals, because it is the project manager who completes the technical side of business build, and the project manager will is a conduit, if you like, who builds the networks with the wider community. Then the Indigenous community can link into those networks. But you do need somebody from the community I've discovered to bring that community together so that they can lead their own business build, so they can make their own decisions. It's possible. It is possible because the community development advisors here have gone into Indigenous communities and other communities and successfully facilitated a community development project. But I believe that depends on the advisor, not so much on the role. So there's a lot of advisors who are not competent. Yeah. Right.
And Ryan, could you just speak maybe briefly, and then I'll get to Kiara. Ryan, just the importance of the role of community champions, who are often just volunteers in getting various programs up running.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the community investment programs, there's three, kind of similar to what you were just hearing, three different kind of key catalysts. One is, I guess we could diplomatically say, inspiration by neighbors. So they see a neighboring community do something and they get inspired. The non-diplomatic phrase that we hear in rural Canada is the hockey wars. If they can do it, we can do it, sort of thinking process. The second is some sort of a community development intermediary that works in the community, and that person might be, as Laurie mentioned, a volunteer, but they kind of serve as that intermediary between the good idea and the policy program actual environment. And that individual is able to bridge the connection, sometimes to literally translate between government speak and community language, but they serve as that intermediary. And the other third catalyst that we discovered were government employees that would lead the initiative, that would actually go out into community to work with community members where they're at on their initiatives. Unfortunately, those government leads were disappearing due to budget cuts and perception that the programs are no longer needed because there's less applicants. And so that is a bit difficult. But the value of community champions cannot be understated. It's not something that is well articulated in the policy or the program delivery, but every investment program that we spoke to reiterated that without those community champions, they would not be able to succeed. Yet those are champions that are not mobilized with financial resources. They often are not mobilized with program knowledge. They've simply been resilient and have gone out and found it and interpreted it. It's not because it's being training that's being provided to them. And so it speaks to the resilience of those community champions at the end of the day.
Okay, and is it Kiara?
And then after Kira, we've got a question from Jade
Sure.
in the chat, if you could take that.
Okay, sure. Yep.
Hi, everyone. I have a question, it's a little bit relating to the point that Jim was making about training for community workers. I suppose in the professional training before they go out into practice, and the interplay between that and the programs and the projects you've talked about. I'm wondering if they emerged from the community in either of your cases, or if they're related to the funding structures that are available. And if it is related to the funding structures, what was the impetus for these types of funding these types of programs initially? Like, where did they come from? So my question is for either or both of you. Thank you.
Can I answer that first, Ryan? Thank you. So the business model came from the research that baby boomers were retiring and Māori would suffer poverty and deprivation because of high unemployment. But also the government cannot sustain the social welfare benefit. They just can't, because of the baby boomer generation retirement. And if you think about it, if you've got 50 people drawing $300 per week over a 4-year period, that's $3 million. So for the government, it makes sense that they are investing in community development, which will develop jobs, community economic development, which develops jobs, which then gets these people off long-term benefit dependency.
Okay, Ryan?
From the Canadian context, the push initially came from communities and businesses that they were struggling to find the necessary financial capital to either start or to expand businesses. And so they pushed in partnership with the provincial government in Nova Scotia to create that policy. What we saw in other jurisdictions is other provincial governments looking at that initiative, that first experience, and replicating that program, customizing it to their own local scenarios. But very much the initial impetus was communities and businesses struggling to find a way to do the things they want to do in the current scenario and climate that they were operating in.
Okay, I'm gonna take ask Jade's question for Naumai, and then we'll have a conversation about future topics and what kind of times work for people in different areas of the world. So Naumai, Jade's question is, how has engagement progressed with the Australian side of this stream of work?
Not very good, actually. The Indigenous corporations are conservative, so they receive millions of dollars each year, and it's spent in a traditional manner, and they will not look outside of their own way of doing things to trial a new way of doing things, and this is what it is. This is what this business model is. Although, to be fair to the Australian corporations, the Aboriginal corporations, the New Zealand corporations are the same. So yes, not very well. But that I believe is a marketing effectively, and going to the governments and saying, I have this business model, give me a contract, and then X amount of communities are developed economically.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan and Naumai. And I'll mention Naumai was up at 3 a.m. when we started for Naumai. So this is partly why we're many thanks for being up at that time to be able to participate in this event. We are interested in any other topic ideas. You can either put them in the chat or raise your hand if you want to speak to a topic idea. We're also interested in any thoughts on how the time of this event has been working for different people around the world. And if there's a time that we could try and find that's better. It's currently 10 a.m. Atlantic Standard Time for me in Canada. I know Ryan is a couple hours behind me. Naumai 3 a.m. I know in Europe it's probably mid-afternoon. The other thing I just want to mention is that we are looking to do another researchers forum in February Sarah, do we have an exact, or Jessica, do we have an exact date for that we're thinking of?
No, but if it was about 3 months from now, it would be the week beginning the 26th of February.
Okay.
And I guess whichever day suits people depend partly on the time. And if we judge the time by, you know what time it started today, your time. So you could say, I would find it better if it was 2 hours earlier than today or 3 hours later. If you could put a few of those ideas in the chat, or if you feel it's okay, you're willing to go to it whatever time of day it is. And if there's a particular day of the week that does or doesn't suit you today, it's a Monday. So a Monday would be something like the 26th of February, for example, if that happens to suit people. But it partly depends on if anybody is willing to present something, if you've got a topic that you would like to present, some research you've been doing, or you could recommend somebody's been doing some research. We have had some discussion sessions, but as Laurie said, the presentation sessions seem to be more popular, but we could do a mixture of presentations and discussions, or a kind of looking at a question or provocation, a brief introduction to a topic which we could then pull apart. So we've got Alberta and South Africa are saying it's okay. System Innovations Network, we've got the link in there. That's good. Okay, so it can be later or earlier.
Yeah, later or earlier in Europe, because it was about 3 o'clock Central Europe time.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on topics, or anyone who might be willing to organize or host a session next time? Sarah kind of started with the hosting. I then, when there was a request, I kind of stepped in myself and offered to help organize and host a couple of sessions. But we are looking, this is not meant to be just Sarah and I. The Researchers Forum is kind of open to other people to host and organize sessions and come up with ideas. So even if you don't have a particular topic in mind, if you might be willing to help host and or organize a session in February, that would be great as well. I see Kira is saying she'd be happy to present a session on research as a practice tool of community development. That's great. And also willing to help host, organize. Awesome. Thank you, Kira. Jim, I see your hand up.
Yes, I would be interested in what is actually happening in the health and welfare structures and system, in the different countries, and the reality of the situation which I live and work is that life expectancy is going down, systematically going down, and in a sense, something like 30% of people who present themselves for ill health reasons, then these reasons are essentially social and not medical in a traditional sense. And we currently have a top-down initiative by the government in what it calls social prescribing. People employed by the health service who, in a sense, have to engage, with people to prescribe, might say, alternatives to the hospitals or whatever. But I was just saying that in a sense, we have a context here in the northeast of England where there's something like 16 years lifespan between people who live in the most disadvantaged community and people who live in the more affluent communities. That's the kind of challenge. And I suppose I didn't actually ever believe that I would live long enough, for life expectancy to be going down, and in a sense, one seems in one way or other to meet some of these challenges, each day. And so I just wondered whether there was a topic. I thought maybe Sarah, from her contacts at university, might know one or two people who in a sense could help us think of that. Claire, people that. Anyway, I'm just very interested in. I checked both New Zealand and Canada, and their life expectancy is much greater than it is in the UK and the northeast of England. So so it was quite interesting. So I just have no sense that that's likely to improve, put it that way. And how do we confront that? It's just a suggestion.
Okay, so we've got that noted maybe as a future meeting after the one on the researchers.
Sure.
Yeah, something else I'll just add that I was thinking about as Ryan and Naumai were presenting, just reflecting on Ryan, the fact that in Canada we have a real demographic crunch, and a lot of the CDIF programs were originally created to encourage baby boomers with money to invest locally in communities and get a retirement savings plan tax credit. So that's one population dynamic. Just as well, you were talking about population, Jim, I was thinking about it might be interesting to explore the impact that demographic issues are having on various community development programs or practices, but also in Canada, the Indigenous population in Canada is the youngest population in Canada. And really, there's a lot of interest and hope in reconciliation and economic development in Indigenous communities because they have a younger population. And I see, so I just wanted to mention that as maybe a topic. I'm not quite sure what exactly the topic would be, but I just think those are a couple of interesting demographic changes that could be explored from an international perspective. I also see Michael is making a topic suggestion for urban areas, new bottom-up approaches to neighborhood development. And he notes we work with a model alternative, which we have developed. That's great. So that may be something to combine with what Kara was mentioning, if it has a research basis. I see also someone CP. I would be interested in pursuing CED as a response to the growing worldwide movement of politics far right. Yeah, so and Michael's just saying he couldn't do February. Okay, so that's fine. So we know that. And then Tis is mentioning a critical question we are facing is how to create the entrepreneurial mindset amongst rural community members. The lack of entrepreneurial mindset is one of the major barriers in addressing the growing extreme economic equality in South Africa. Yes, so it would be very interesting to hear other perspectives from other parts of the world, and both from an Indigenous perspective, as Naumai was speaking to, as well as other perspectives. Yeah, so some great ideas. It's 11:30, so I'm going to close this session. If you have any last minute thoughts about a change in time or a particular day of the week that you think you would prefer, please put that in the chat quick before you leave. Same for any topic headings. Again, I want to thank Naumai and Ryan for presenting today. I think they were very exciting presentations. Thank you to Sarah for co-hosting, and to all of you for participating and asking great questions. Thank you.